Hey, what's up YouTube? Today we'll be having a look at Fiio's latest flagship device, the X7 Mark II. As part of the review, we'll also be looking at how it compares to the first iteration, the original X7, and the X5 3rd gen as well, and of course the iDSD black label. So let's first check out an unboxing and then we'll get on with the review. See you soon. So here we have all three devices, the X5 3rd gen, the X7 Mark II, and the first X7. Now, as we can see, the Mark II shares a lot of design elements from both of these devices. It's pretty much the perfect marriage of both designs here, whereas we have slightly more rounded corners of the original X7 as opposed to the sharper corners on the X5 3rd gen, but then we also have these side design elements that have been carried over from the X5 3rd gen. It's a pretty pleasing design. It's modern, it's got very nice bold lines, and these chamfered edges have also been taken over from the original X7. So if we take a quick look around the device, the bottom edge is where we have the swappable amp module. We've got a standard single-ended output, a micro USB, as well as a 2.5mm balanced port. The top edge of the device is where we'll find the line out, coax and optical combo port, as well as the power button. Storage trays, which has a very interesting design that they've also taken over from the X5 3rd gen. It pretty much looks like the SIM card trays that you'd find on a modern smartphone. It's a very neat design, although not entirely convenient in case you want to quickly swap out, as you'd need a little tool to do so. Play pause button, the volume dial, as well as the skip rocker button. Now, as you might be able to tell just by looking at the design of these devices, all three of them have a touch interface. Now, this is because all three of them run a version of Android. In this case, all three have been updated to the latest version available for each device, and that is Android 5.1.1. So as far as interacting with the device with the touch display, all three of them are pretty much identical. All three of them have a 3.97-inch display, and there are some slight differences in how those displays render colors. Compared to the original X7, the Mark II has slightly warmer colors, which means that whites have a yellowish tint to them, whereas the original has more of a bluish tint to it. The Mark II also seems to have more contrast than the original, which gives the appearance that the original has a higher dynamic range, and so images just seem a little bit more detailed on the original than on the Mark II. Compared to the X5 3rd gen, the Mark II has a noticeably brighter screen, and the display also seems to have been mounted closer to the glass panel. Now, because of this extra brightness and the closer mounting to the glass panel, it does give better legibility outdoors and also seems to be less reflective. Overall, as far as the design is concerned, Fiio seem to have done a pretty good job. with some minor quality control issues here and there. The biggest ones that are most noticeable is where the swappable amp modules line up with the rest of the body. Now it's pretty obvious where the amp module meets up with the rest of the body. Now this isn't a major problem, but it just doesn't scream refined design either. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the UI. Now all three of these Fiio devices, as mentioned previously, runs Android 5.1.1. So essentially the software and the entire UI looks pretty much identical on all three of Fiio's devices. Now this is somewhat a good thing, as it means jumping from one device to the other in case you're upgrading or whatever the case may be is very, very simple, as they all work exactly the same way. But on the flip side, it means that some of the software bugs contained in one device are carried over into the other as well. Okay, and then there's another double-edged sword. Well over 80% of the world's mobile phones run one or another flavor of Android. And this is purely because the whole basis of Android is that it's open source. So many hardware manufacturers like LG or Samsung, etc., can use Android software to operate on their devices. So of course, because there are more manufacturers available, then the Android's market share is increasing. So the good part about using Android on a music player means that jumping over from your mobile phone onto the music player is essentially seamless, because they work very, very similarly. And the good thing about that is, because it's Android, it can run third-party apps. So you can install something like Spotify or Tidal, and you can really make this a one-device solution for your entire music needs, whether that be streaming over the internet or streaming via Bluetooth or over Wi-Fi, or whether you just want to play music from a memory card or from the internal storage. This device can do all of that. However, this is where the bad side of that double-edged sword comes in as well. Because so many people are used to how Android runs on their phones, well, mobile phones tend to have better processing power than what these devices do. So unfortunately, the thing about Android is that it is a pretty resource intensive operating system. Yes, with every new iteration that comes out, it does become more battery efficient, it does become more resource efficient, but essentially it is still a pretty heavy operating system. And so what happens now is that you're used to a phone that runs Android, and you've got the processing power to fluidly run Android, but then you go over onto something like this, which doesn't quite have the same processing power. And so that is where using Android as the interface for a music player with less than ideal processing power can come back to bite you in the behind. As we use our mobile phones on a daily basis, we've become accustomed to a certain responsiveness. And unfortunately, because this device doesn't have the same processing power as a modern smartphone, never mind even a flagship smartphone, but just one of the modern ones, it does show that lack of processing power can come across in small stutters or lags. So coming back to the Mark II, this is something that seems a little confusing. Fiio have bragged that they've increased the total RAM count to 2 gigabytes on this device. So by doubling the RAM, you'd expect it to be a slightly faster device, right? Well, not so much. In many cases, I've actually found that this device is slower than the original X7, which came out 2 years ago, but also sometimes it's slower than the X5 3rd gen. Okay, so before I explain a little bit more of that, let me just show you something about how these devices work. Now, Fiio have implemented the same feature in all of their devices. Basically, you get two modes of operation. You get a pure music mode and an Android mode. In Android mode, it kind of operates like a modern smartphone, where you have an Android interface and you can install apps and you can browse the internet and what have you. But then there's also the pure music mode, which essentially allows only Fio's pure music playing app to run, and it's intended to make all the processing power available simply to that app, so you can have an uninterrupted music experience. So in order to switch over between them, you just simply pull down there, and then you've got a toggle here which will ask you if you want to switch over to Android mode or to pure music mode. Okay, so in testing the speed of the device and comparing it to the other two devices, I did a simple boot up test. Now you can boot up either in Android mode or in pure music mode. The first one I did was pure music mode. Now the X5 3rd gen managed to boot up in a total of 35 seconds. The first X7 did so in 27 seconds. And surprisingly, the X7 Mark II did it in 40 seconds. Now that's a little weird, right? Why would their latest flagship that has more RAM be slower than the previous devices? So I then did the same test by booting up into Android mode. Now this did prove to be a little bit faster. The X5 3rd gen did so in 32 seconds, the original X7 did so in 25 seconds, and the X7 Mark II did so in 34 seconds. So again, consistently, the X7 Mark II comes in last place. Okay, and then came another test, which is to use a 200 gigabyte SanDisk card loaded up with around 6,500 tracks, which is a mix of MP3s, FLAC, and DSD files, and around 500 JPEG images, which are used for album arts. I made sure that there are no extra folders or files that are used by the Android system, such as the databases that it builds. So this is usually labeled as an Android folder and a lost.dir folder. All of those have been removed, and so each scan was fresh. So the X5 3rd gen managed to do it in 5 minutes flat. The original X7 did so in 4 minutes and 46 seconds, whereas the X7 Mark II managed to do it in 4 minutes and 47 seconds. So essentially the same as the original, despite that extra 1 gig of RAM. But still, it's not a lot faster than the X5 3rd gen. Now, interestingly enough, the tiny little Shanling M2S managed to do the exact same thing in 3 minutes and 16 seconds. So essentially what this means is that the Mark II took more than 40% longer than the M2S. Now I can guarantee you that the M2S does not have the processing power that's built into this device. So it's really weird to see this device being so much slower than the Shanling. Okay, so how can this be? How can this flagship be so much slower than a $200 device, despite having so much more processing power? Well, I suspect that it's the same problem that plagues each and every single one of Fiio's devices, and that's the software. Honestly speaking, Fiio is just not up to it in terms of software. Whether it be their resources or their knowledge or whatever it is, software just is not their forte. I'm just going to go out and say it, and they suck at the software. Now to illustrate this, as I said, it took 4 minutes 47 seconds for this device to do that 200 gig card scan. I then went over and switched over into Android mode and installed Hibi Music. Now if you're not familiar with Hibi Music, it's a free music player app available for Android and I believe for iOS as well, which is just a phenomenal app, and how they still managed to make it free is beyond me, but it's by far my absolute favorite app to use. So switching over to Hibi, I did the same card test, and you'd be surprised with what the result was. Hibi managed to scan that entire card in a total of 1 minute and 40 seconds. Yep, that's right, 1 minute and 40 seconds. That's more than double the speed of Fiio's music app. So clearly this must be a software issue. Hibi is just better at managing Android's processing power and resources, because obviously the hardware didn't change, so it must be down to software, right? So as I said, unfortunately, this is the thing that keeps holding Fiio back from making truly great devices. Now another weird thing is that neither the X5 3rd gen nor the X7 Mark II has a properly implemented USB output. Now by that I mean being able to plug in an external DAC and having the audio routed through the USB, the micro USB port into the external DAC. Now I can't say that this is true for all external DACs, but in trying to use the iFi iDSD black label, neither of those two devices were able to output audio to it. But oddly enough, the original X7 was perfectly capable of doing this. So why would the new flagship have this feature lacking? Okay, and then we get on to three little annoyances that occurred for me as a reviewer. So as I've explained in my previous videos, is I always go ahead and volume match. So how I test between two devices, especially when it comes to DAPs, is I would take two cards and load up the exact same number of tracks, and then I would plug in the headphones into one device, press play on both devices so that they go through the exact same track at the exact same time. And so when I want to swap over the cable, I just hit pause on both of them and do the swap. So when I jump from one device to the other, then I do so at the exact same point in time of each track. And it's with this swapping of the cable that the first annoyance came along. So let me just show you a setting in the Mark II in the audio settings. So we see here is inline remote. So what this allows you to do is to turn on the functionality of the inline remote that comes installed on some IEMs and other headphones. In my case, this was the Fiio F9 IEMs. So the annoyance was that on this device I would hit pause and then unplug the cable, but the moment I unplugged it, then for whatever reason it somehow got a signal to say, oh no, okay, now you must carry on playing. So if I didn't notice, I would switch over to the other device and then go ahead and say, oh, now the time is no longer synced up between the two devices. So this is where I saw my first software bug for this device, was that irrespective of whether this setting is turned on or off, once you reboot the device, it goes back to having that functionality as being on, irrespective of whether it actually shows here a check mark or not. So the only way to get rid of that was to turn it on and turn it off again. And then came the second bug. This is something that is really weird, because I don't know how Fiio could have possibly missed this had they even remotely properly tested the device. And that is, every now and again, for whatever reason, the Mark II would just stop outputting any sound. And it didn't matter whether I skipped to a next song, whether I pressed play or pause. The only way to fix it was one of two ways: either rebooting the device, or I did find another way, and I'm not entirely sure why this works, but there's a setting in the Mark II that the first gen and the X5 third gen does not have. In settings, there is a performance mode, and you can switch from balanced to high performance. Now, when I got the issue of it not outputting sound, all that I would do is go into there, change the setting. So if it was in high performance, I'd switch over into balanced, or vice versa, then go back into the music app and then change the track, and then change back to the track that I wanted to. And then it would work fine. Most of the time, this wasn't a solid fix that I could find. So again, I don't know how Fiio could have possibly missed that. Okay, so the last issue comes into what I was saying earlier about our expectations of the responsiveness of a system. So what I was saying was, when I switch over from one device to the other, I would hit pause, but that's where I got the issue with this device, is that when I would hit, now of course, now when I try it, it's going to work, but every so often I would tap on the play or pause, whatever it was at the time, and it would just not do anything. And I would try again, and it would not do anything. So even if I had pressed pause on the other device, well, this just carried on playing. So of course it just messed up my sync. So really all that comes down to is a touch display that's not quite as responsive as what I'm used to on any other smartphone. But thankfully, all of these devices do have hardware buttons as well, and so it was just getting used to using those instead of using the display to reliably be able to pause a song and do the swap of the cable. Okay, so let's finally talk about the sound. Now, I need to give you a little bit of backstory on the X7 device. When the original X7 came out about 2 years ago, this actual device was actually part of the world tour. Now, this was an entirely new type of device for Fiio, and there's a lot of people who are fanboys, to some extent myself included, of Fiio, and so there was a lot of hype that was built up around this device, which proved to be a bit damaging for myself personally anyways. See, the problem is, I don't know if any device has ever truly 100% lived up to the hype around it. And that's kind of the negative side of creating hype for a product, because it gives someone this extreme expectation of a device, and you risk by the time them getting that device that it doesn't live up to expectation, and they might very well be disappointed, which was exactly the case for me with this device. I read about impressions of people going on about how the sound was so holographic and it was just heavenly and what have you, all the good things. But by the time I got it, I thought to myself, but okay, it sounds fine, I suppose, but it's nowhere near what they described. So this time around, I decided, when this device came out, I'm not going to look at other reviews, I'm not going to look at any of the forum posts. I'm essentially going to go into it as a virgin. I didn't want, if the device was bad, I also didn't want it to give me any preliminary bad vibes about the device. And I honestly cannot tell you how glad I am that I did that, because this device really took me by surprise. As I said, I was very disappointed with this. However, the Mark II is definitely a step up from this. It sounds clear, it sounds dynamic, it sounds balanced, it sounds refined. It doesn't matter what music you throw at it, it handles it like a damn champion. I mean, overall, it's such a wonderfully enjoyable sound. It's not pedantically analytical, it's not boring, it's not it's not fatiguing, it doesn't feel like a chore to listen to it. Overall, I would characterize it as having a slightly warm sound, very slightly, and just a touch of smoothness up top, but nowhere near as warm or overly smooth as the X5 3rd gen. So as I said, it's definitely a step up from the first X7. I mean, they really just have such a different sound to them. Whereas the original X7 just has this rolled off and just excessively smooth sound in comparison. It has no sparkle. It doesn't, when you think about hi-fi sound, it doesn't sound hi-fi. It doesn't have that hi-fi clarity that I was expecting it to have. Whereas the Mark II definitely has that. Now, of course, when digital audio is reproduced, the DAC has an influence on how it sounds, as does the amplification stage. And these two do not have the same amp modules. This has the latest one, the AM3A, whereas this has the AM1. But I did swap the two around to see how much of an effect that had, and it did close the gap between them a little bit, but it's no substitute. The DAC in this, it really does give it a much different sound than what you get from the original X7. And then we get on to how it compares to the X5 3rd gen. Now, as I said earlier, I was not a fan of the X5 3rd gen, and it sounded boring to me. It sounded too warm, it sounded too smooth. And oddly enough, it's only when I now did this comparison that I realized just why I didn't like it. Because I then compared the X5 3rd gen to the original X7, and they sounded damn near identical. So similar that I don't know if the differences that I heard, if they actually exist, or if that's just completely in my head. So that's how similar they sounded. Now, that could be considered a good thing for the X5 3rd gen, saying, hey Fiio, you did a good job, you were able to take the sound quality of the original X7 and slam it into a much cheaper device. But it's still not what I would consider to be great sound. So because it sounds so similar to me, my comparison between the X5 3rd Gen and the Mark II is exactly the same as my comparison was between the Mark II and the original X7. So now of course we get to the main event, and that is, how does the Mark II compare to the exceptionally good iFi iDSD Black Label? Truly a very, very interesting comparison. You might think that it would be unfair to compare these two, as this is a vastly more superior device in terms of the technology used and how it was put together, and what its intended purpose is. But the X7 Mark II is a very, very capable device. No, the iDSD is not the best sounding device out there. It's close to what the Hugo 2 sounds like, but it's not quite up there. However, you would pay considerably more to get a significant, or what I would consider at least to be a significant improvement over this. And so I think it's entirely appropriate to use the Black Label as the benchmark for all the other comparisons. Okay, so how does the X7 Mark II compare to the Black Label? It's not quite on the same level, but good grief, it is close. Very, very close. Compared to the Black Label, the Mark II does have a slightly narrower soundstage, and it's also got a bit of a thicker presentation, which makes it more intimate and slightly smoother. But in no way are any of the micro details lost. It's just that they're not quite as clear as you'd hear on the iDSD. So the iDSD does have the edge in clarity, instrument separation, and realism, but holy cow, does the Mark II get close to it. Like, genuinely, surprisingly close to it. So this is kind of the charm and where the value of the X7 Mark II really comes into play, because it does make the argument for using a single device very, very strong. And by single device, I mean not having to stack anything with an external DAC. Keep in mind that the X7 Mark II, or any DAP, is a self-contained unit. It is just a single device, and it's intended to handle all of your audio needs. And in this case, that includes online streaming. So really, summarizing this, to be honest with you, as a reviewer, I would still pick the iDSD just because it has that edge in sound quality. But, and of course this would be entirely a subjective opinion, but I strongly feel that if you're not a reviewer, and if you don't need the power that the iFi can deliver, then the X7 Mark II it's a very, very good device. So much so that it's kind of the best of both worlds. It's got exceptionally good sound, and it's obviously more compact than what something like the iDSD is. And then there's something else to keep in mind. The iDSD, or any other external DAC or amplifier, on its own is a useless device, right? Its job is to decode audio, but it needs to get that audio from somewhere. So it does need to get stacked with either another music player or a mobile phone. So really, this device alone is not the entirety of what your portable music setup would look like. You would have to take into account the other device as well. In which case, the X7 Mark II becomes even more portable than what this does stacked with another device. Essentially, you can just take the X7, pick it up and go. Obviously take some headphones with, but that's your entire device. Now traditionally the argument was that an external DAC is able to house much higher quality components. It's not constrained by the compact size required for a single device like a music player or a mobile phone. So usually the argument was that therefore you can fit higher quality components into an external DAC, and therefore it would be giving you much better sound quality. Now usually that proved to be perfectly true, and really this is where the charm of the X7 Mark II comes in again. It's blurring those lines between, do you really, really need a external DAC for really, really great sound, or can you get away with just using a single device like the Mark II? And honestly, as I said, As a reviewer, I would pick this device purely because it has that edge in sound quality, but obviously the Mark II is so much more compact, and it just makes sense that you would take a slight hit, and I do mean very slight hit, in audio quality in favor of a much more compact design and device. But of course, it's not a perfect device either. Unfortunately, as mentioned in the UI section, the software is really what lets Fiio's devices down each and every single time. And really, the software downgrades it from being a absolutely superb device to just a very, very good device. And that's really unfortunate, I really, really hope that Fiio would pay more attention to their software side of their devices. Although myself and many other people have been saying this for well over a year, going on 2 years now. But having said that, you simply cannot argue with the outright sonic quality of the Mark II. And it takes a lot for me to say this, but I almost want to forgive it for its shortcomings in the software department, purely just because of how incredibly well it does audio. It really does sound that good. So that brings the review to an end. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, please hit that like button. If you disliked it, go ahead and hit the dislike button. If you've got any questions or comments, please leave them in the comments. And if you don't mind, please subscribe to my channel. That does help me a lot. And I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers, YouTube.